Welcome to the Haunted Lore podcast. Each week, we venture into the darkest corners of the world's most legendary folklore to bring you tales that will chill you to the bone. The stories you hear are drawn from historical accounts, urban legends, and the whispers that travel through small towns across this nation. Before we begin, I want to remind you that what follows may disturb some listeners. Tonight's episode contains references to murder, child endangerment, and disturbing imagery. Listener discretion is advised. What happens when grief turns to madness? When a mother's love becomes twisted beyond recognition? Today, we travel to the small town of Terrell, Texas, where in the late 1800s, a tragedy set in motion one of the most chilling urban legends in Texas history. A legend that continues to haunt the nightmares of children and adults alike over a century later. This is the story of Clara Crane, the Candy Lady. Terrell, Texas, 1871. A child was born who would someday cast a long shadow over this quiet farming community. Her name was Clara Crane. For the first 2 decades of her life, there was nothing remarkable about Clara. She grew up on a farm like many others in the area, eventually marrying a local man named Leonard Gilbert Crane. The couple seemed happy enough, and in 1888, they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Marcella. By all accounts, Marcella was the light of Clara's life. Those who knew the family would later recall how Clara doted on her daughter, how her face would brighten whenever the little girl entered the room. Leonard was a hard-working farmer, often busy with the demands of rural life, leaving much of Marcella's care to Clara. But the Cranes' simple life was shattered in 1893. One summer afternoon, while under her father's supervision, 5-year-old Marcella was involved in a tragic farming accident. The details of exactly what happened that day vary depending on who tells the tale, but what remains consistent is that young Marcella lost her life, and Clara blamed her husband entirely. Grief can transform a person. It can hollow them out and fill the void with something else entirely. For Clara Crane, grief became a vessel for rage, resentment, and eventually madness. For 2 years following Marcella's death, Clara continued living with Leonard. Neighbors would later report that she became withdrawn, speaking little and smiling never. What they couldn't see was what was happening inside Clara's mind. The careful, methodical planning of revenge. Leonard Crane had a weakness for sweets, particularly caramel candies. Clara had often made them for him before Marcella's death. In 1895, 2 years after losing her daughter, Clara prepared a special batch of her husband's favorite treats. This time, however, she added an additional ingredient: poison. Historical records don't specify what poison Clara used. Some versions of the story suggest it was arsenic, widely available at the time for pest control. Others claim it was a concoction of her own creation, derived from toxic plants found on their farm. Whatever the substance, its effects were devastating. Leonard Crane died an agonizing death. In an era before sophisticated forensic techniques, Clara might have gotten away with her crime, claiming her husband had fallen ill naturally, but something in her had broken. When the local doctor came to examine the body, Clara confessed immediately, displaying no remorse. "He took my Marcella," she reportedly told authorities. "So I took him." Clara was arrested and convicted of first-degree murder. However, rather than being sentenced to death or imprisonment, she was committed to the North Texas Lunatic Asylum, a decision that likely reflected the court's view that her actions stemmed from mental instability brought on by grief. The asylum was a grim place, typical of mental institutions of that era. Patients were often subjected to experimental treatments and inhumane conditions. It was here, isolated from society, that the already damaged Clara Crane began her final transformation into something truly monstrous. Staff at the asylum would later report strange behaviors. Clara would collect scraps of fabric from torn bedsheets and clothing. At night, she would sit in her cell, sewing by moonlight. Eventually, they discovered what she was creating: a crude doll made from the gathered materials. Clara had named the doll Marcella. She would speak to the doll as if it were her daughter, carrying on one-sided conversations and singing lullabies. The asylum doctors documented this behavior as a manifestation of her unresolved grief. What they couldn't have known was that Clara's connection to the doll represented something far more sinister than mere delusion. In 1899, due to severe overcrowding, the asylum released a number of patients deemed non-violent back into society. Despite her history, Clara was among them. Perhaps the years of apparent docility had convinced the doctors she no longer posed a threat. Perhaps they simply needed the bed. Whatever the reason, Clara Crane, killer of her husband and now deeply detached from reality, walked free, carrying her doll Marcella with her. And here is where history gives way to legend. Official records of Clara Crane go cold after her release. She disappears from census data and local documentation. But in the oral history of Terrell, Texas, her story was just beginning. Around 1903, approximately 4 years after Clara's release from the asylum, children in Terrell began to report something unusual. They would wake to find candies, specifically caramels, placed on their windowsills. Some claimed the sweets came with handwritten notes that read, "From the Candy Lady," or invitations to come out and play with Marcella. Most parents dismissed these stories as childhood imagination or pranks. But then, children began to disappear. Over the course of the next decade, local legend claims that 8 children vanished from Terrell and surrounding areas. Always under similar circumstances, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, just an empty bed, and sometimes a candy wrapper left behind. The town's sheriff, a man named Robert Holden, according to some versions of the tale, began an investigation. He started by interviewing the children who had received candies but hadn't accepted the invitation to come out and play. Their descriptions were consistent. An older woman with wild grey hair, wearing a tattered dress, always carrying a cloth doll. She would appear at night, leaving sweets and whispering to children through their windows. Sheriff Holden organized search parties to comb the woods and abandoned structures around Terrell. Then, 2 weeks into his investigation, the sheriff himself disappeared. His body was discovered near a lake outside of town. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. He had been beaten to death. But what truly terrified the townsfolk were 2 details. His pockets were filled with caramel candies, and 2 dinner forks had been stabbed into his eyes. The town fell into a panic. Parents would no longer allow their children to play outside after dusk. Windows were nailed shut despite the Texas heat. Some families left Terrell altogether, unwilling to risk becoming part of the growing legend of the Candy Lady. Then came perhaps the most disturbing development of all. A farmer tending his fields northwest of town reported finding candy wrappers scattered across his land. Inside some of these wrappers, he claimed to have discovered tiny, rotted teeth, presumably belonging to the missing children. vigilante groups formed to hunt down the Candy Lady, but no one ever found Clara Crane, if indeed she was responsible for these horrors. The disappearances eventually stopped, but the legend persisted, growing and evolving with each telling. Some versions of the story claim that Clara was finally caught and lynched by a mob of townspeople, her body buried in an unmarked grave. Others insist she escaped into the wilderness, living for decades in a cabin deep in the East Texas woods, continuing to lure unsuspecting children to their doom. The most unnerving version, however, suggests she was never caught because she never died. In this telling, the Clara Crane who emerged from the asylum was no longer fully human. Her grief and madness had opened a door to something supernatural, transforming her into an entity that feeds on the innocence of children, a boogeyman that continues to haunt Terrell to this day. Residents of Terrell still warn their children not to accept candy from strangers. Parents have been known to invoke the name of the Candy Lady when disciplining particularly troublesome kids. Be good, or the Candy Lady will come for you tonight. In local schools, older children dare each other to say Clara Crane 3 times in front of a mirror at midnight, a ritual reminiscent of Bloody Mary, but with a distinctly Texan flavor. And on particularly dark nights, some claim to see an elderly woman walking the streets of Terrell, a cloth doll clutched to her chest, candies spilling from her pockets. What makes the legend of the Candy Lady so enduring is the blending of verifiable history with supernatural horror. Clara Crane was a real woman. She did murder her husband after losing her daughter. She was committed to an asylum and later released. These facts are documented. Everything that came after, the candies on windowsills, the disappearances, the sheriff's gruesome murder, exists in that shadowy realm between history and folklore. Could a grieving mother's madness have transformed her into a monster? Or is the Candy Lady simply a cautionary tale designed to keep children safe in an era before stranger danger was a common concept? Whatever the truth, the legacy of Clara Crane continues to haunt the collective imagination of Terrell, Texas. And perhaps that's the point of such legends, to give shape to our fears, to provide a name and face for the nameless, faceless dangers that might lurk in the darkness. The story of Clara Crane, the Candy Lady, combines historical tragedy with the supernatural elements that often emerge when communities process their darkest chapters. While many details of the legend have been embellished over time, the core of the story, a mother's grief twisted into something monstrous, resonates because it speaks to very real human fears. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the show by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, leaving a rating and review, or sharing with a friend who appreciates the darker side of American folklore. This is the Haunted Lore Podcast, reminding you that sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that might be true.